Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was never one to back down from a challenge. But in November of 1959, he faced something truly bizarre. It all started with a letter from a South African man who claimed to be a dermatologist. His name was Dr. Lawrence Landau, and he promised to make Elvis look younger with his magical aromatherapy treatments. Landau wrote to Elvis, gushing about his method. He claimed to have a secret formula made from ground-up flowers, yogurt, and resins. He said that after 10 weeks of these treatments, Elvis's skin would be smoother, his pores would shrink, and his acne scars would disappear. Landau was so confident that he offered to treat Elvis for free until they saw results. All he needed was passage to Germany and a place to stay. Elvis, who was only 24 but already worried about aging, was intrigued. His skin had always been a source of insecurity, especially his large pores. So he had his assistant, Elizabeth Stefaniak, start corresponding with Landau. The letters went back and forth, with Landau getting more and more insistent about when he could come to Germany. He even threatened to be heartbroken if Elvis didn't answer soon enough. Despite the warnings, Landau showed up at the gate one day uninvited. Elvis, curious and a bit nervous, let him in. Landau started his treatments, slathering Elvis's face with a strange concoction. He even made Elvis eat some of it. Red and I, Elvis's friends, watched in disbelief as Elvis went along with it, thinking he was getting younger by the day. But Landau wasn't just a weird skin specialist. He was also a nosy, aggressive, and bossy man. He started watching the guys too closely, and one day he crossed the line. While giving Elvis a facial massage, Landau's hand slipped down and gave Elvis a squeeze. Elvis jumped up, furious. Red and I rushed in, and I had to hold Elvis back to keep him from attacking Landau. Red managed to get Landau out of the house, but the damage was done. On Christmas Eve, Landau came back, acting like nothing had happened. He wished everyone a Merry Christmas and asked Elvis when he wanted his next appointment. Elvis, still fuming, told him to get lost. Landau went ballistic, tearing a photo album in half and threatening to expose compromising photos and recordings of Elvis with a young girl. Vernon, Elvis's father, was terrified. He made Elvis tell his commanding officer everything, and the MP were called in. Elvis told them that Landau had made homosexual advances to his friends, but he never mentioned the incident with him. Later, we found out that Landau wasn't even a real doctor. He was just a con artist trying to make a quick buck, but the story didn't end there. Landau started blackmailing Elvis, threatening to go to the papers unless he got more money. Vernon was so worried that he had Elvis offer Landau a few $100s and a plane ticket to London. Landau agreed but then demanded even more money, claiming he had given up his entire practice in South Africa for Elvis. The situation spiraled out of control, and Elvis was forced to take drastic measures. But the question remained, what did Landau really have on Elvis, and how far would he go to keep his secrets hidden? As Elvis prepared to return to the United States, he knew that the world he was leaving behind in Germany was just the beginning of his troubles. The army had changed him, but the real test was yet to come. Elvis's return from the army marked a significant change in his life. His mother, Gladys, had passed away while he was away, and this loss deeply affected him. He became more self-confident in some ways, but also harder and more guarded. His relationships with those around him, including his father Vernon and his new stepmother Dee, were strained. Sinatra, a powerhouse in the entertainment industry, had been critical of Elvis in the past. When Elvis was invited to appear on Sinatra's television special, it was a big deal. Sinatra charged a whopping $125,000 for the show, a fortune at the time. Elvis wasn't sure about it, feeling that the show might make fun of him, as Steve Allen had done in 1956. However, when Elvis returned from the show, he said that Sinatra and his crew had been nothing but nice to his face. Nevertheless, rumors persisted that Sinatra couldn't stand being around Elvis, even if they were polite in public. Elvis's musical direction also shifted. After the army, he started to explore a more mainstream pop sound with songs like It's Now or Never and Are You Lonesome Tonight? These songs were more dramatic and romantic, reflecting his new persona. He was drawn to the dramatic recitations of Charles Boyer and the powerful preaching of Pentecostal ministers, which influenced his singing style. The first movie Elvis made after returning from the Army was G.I. Blues, where he played a soldier. This movie also marked the beginning of his on-set relationship with actress Juliette Prowse, who was older and more experienced. Their relationship didn't last, but it added to the drama of Elvis's personal life. At home, Elvis took on a more dominant role. He fired his father Virunernan from his job and became the head of the household. He struggled with the loss of his mother, who had been his confidante. Dee, his father's new wife, tried to get close to him, but Elvis made it clear that she would never replace his mother. This tension led to a difficult relationship between Elvis and Dee, who eventually moved into a house on the property but not into his mother's room. Drug use became a significant issue for Elvis during this period. He started taking uppers and other pills to cope with the stress and to maintain his energy. His friends noticed that he had an addictive personality and loved the feeling of being high. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, pushed him to make more movies to keep the money rolling in, and the pressure only increased his reliance on drugs. Elvis's entourage grew during this time, with new members like Charlie Hodge, Joe Esposito, and Sonny West joining the group. Joe, in particular, took on a managerial role, handling paperwork and personal bills. Elvis paid his friends a salary, but it wasn't much, as he didn't want them to become too independent. The group was like a family, and they had a code of loyalty, although Joe sometimes broke this code as he became more confident. Despite the challenges, Elvis continued to perform and record. He went to Las Vegas to cool down after the release of G.I. Blues, and he appeared in lounges where he often encountered other celebrities like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. These encounters were often playful, but they also highlighted the tension between Elvis and the established stars of the time. Elvis's life was a mix of success, personal struggles, and the pressure to meet the expectations of his fans and the entertainment industry. His relationships, both personal and professional, were complex, and his struggles with drugs and control would continue to shape his life in the years to come. Charlie Hodge was a part of Elvis's life, but only sometimes. In the 1960s, Charlie wasn't always around. He had his own gigs with Red Foley and Jimmy Wakely, but when he wasn't working, he'd show up at Graceland. Charlie was a small guy, about 5 feet 5 inches, and he'd bring his little bag of clothes. He'd stay for a while, until he had to go back on the road. Sometimes, when Charlie drank too much, he'd annoy people. When Elvis came back from the Army, Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin, started working for him. Billy was almost 18, and their relationship changed. Billy could talk to Elvis, but he knew he couldn't say everything he wanted. Working for a family member was odd, especially someone he loved and looked up to. Billy was still hot-tempered and would sometimes rebel. He'd get angry and quit, but Elvis would always take him back. Elvis called Billy Mighty Mouth because he used his words like a weapon. When Elvis became famous, Billy felt special being his cousin. But in North Memphis, he'd get into fights because he'd run his mouth. At Graceland, Billy was rebellious. He thought everyone should love Elvis like he did, and if they said something bad about Elvis, he'd confront them. This gave him a reputation as a troublemaker. It wasn't until he was older that he realized he needed to calm down. Elvis changed after the Army. He became more distant and wanted to show that he was the boss. He had more money and fame, and Billy felt hurt by this. But Billy still wanted to prove himself to Elvis and hoped they could understand each other. Lamar Fike, who knew Billy since he was 14, saw a big change in him. Billy went from being a wild kid to a more grounded adult. If left alone, Billy might have ended up in jail or worse. Elvis and the group worked hard to shape Billy into a better person. They even planned ways to kill him, which meant they'd teach him a lesson. Billy had a tough time with the other guys in the group. He thought they were conning him, and it led to conflicts. One time, he got into a fight with Red over cleaning up a mess in Elvis's dressing room. Red hit him hard, and it taught Billy a lesson. In 1962, Billy married his childhood sweetheart, Jo Norris. Everyone loved Jo and couldn't understand how Billy got her. Billy changed a lot after that. He became a different person. Elvis liked the movie Flaming Star because it was a more serious role. He played an Indian, which connected to his own Cherokee heritage. He only sang 2 songs in the movie, which was fine with him because he wanted to focus on acting. The director, Don Siegel, was supportive and cut the songs down to what Elvis wanted. After Flaming Star, Elvis tried to slow down his southern accent and way of talking because he didn't like how he sounded on screen. In 1960, Elvis and the guys got wild. They had been kicked out of hotels for causing trouble. One time, they were having a pizza fight with Sammy Davis Jr. at the Beverly Wilshire. During GI Blues, things got rowdier, and they were asked to leave. Elvis and the Colonel decided to rent a house to avoid the publicity. They moved into a modern house in Bel Air, which was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a change from the old, worn-out stuff Elvis grew up with. They stayed there for about a year before moving to Bellagio Road. Finding a place to rent wasn't always easy. Some people, like Nanette Fabre, wouldn't rent to Elvis and his group because of their reputation. They had a couple, Jimmy and Lillian Jackson, who took care of the house and cooked for them. Elvis didn't want to buy a place in California because he didn't want to call it home. He also had tax reasons. He paid a high percentage in taxes, about 91%, and the Colonel was afraid of the government finding out he wasn't a U.S. citizen. So, instead of investing his money, Elvis paid what he owed ahead of time to avoid any trouble. When the year came to a close and Elvis found out how much money he had made, he was incredibly proud. He used to brag about it, especially when the press said things like, "Elvis Presley is slipping in popularity." He'd laugh and say, "Yeah, I'm really slipping. I made $7 million this year." Elvis made his dad, Vernon, his business manager, even though Elvis hated talking on the phone. Vernon and Elvis would have long conversations between California and Memphis. Vernon wasn't the smartest guy when it came to business, but Elvis trusted him because Vernon said they couldn't trust anyone else. This trust led to a lot of problems with Elvis's finances after he died. Both Elvis and Vernon were so paranoid that they kept everything a secret, and no one knew what was really going on. One time, Vernon made a big investment in a coal mine and lost about $2.5 million. Most of the lawyers, bankers, and accountants Elvis hired were chosen by Vernon. They would do what Vernon told them, even if it wasn't good for Elvis. Vernon made a lot of money for doing almost nothing, about $84,000 a year. Vernon had a hard time reading and writing. He could barely read a contract, and he'd have to point at the words with his finger to figure out what they said. But some people, like Billy Smith, said Vernon could read and write fairly well, even if he didn't understand all the big words. Elvis never talked about business with his friends. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, told him not to. He said, "Don't talk about business. They don't need to know anything. I'll take care of it." Elvis believed him, even though the Colonel was taking advantage of him. Elvis thought he was getting the best deals, but he wasn't. The Colonel had a 20-year contract with RCA, and every time it came up for renewal, the Colonel would say, "They are giving you another year." But Elvis never got better royalties or better deals. Marty Lacker, one of Elvis's friends, realized this later when he got a job in the music business and saw what other artists were getting. The Colonel was all about perks. He had an office at RCA that he rarely used, and he got free stuff all the time. He even made Elvis pay for it sometimes. The William Morris Agency, which represented Elvis, gave the Colonel a house in Palm Springs and an office. They did this because Elvis was their biggest star. The Colonel was always putting on a show. When he negotiated movie contracts, he'd make them change things just to change them. The contracts would get longer and longer, and the Colonel would make the studio executives bring them to him in person. He loved to eat and would have big banquets at the Sahara Hotel in Vegas, where he'd order so much food that it could feed 50 people, just because it was free. The Colonel insisted that everyone call him Colonel, and enjoyed being in charge. He had a special chair made for the head of William Morris, called the Admiral. Elvis was their biggest client, but the Colonel did most of the booking. It's not clear what William Morris did to earn their 10%. When Elvis wasn't filming, he didn't see the Colonel much. The Colonel lived in Palm Springs, and Elvis didn't invite him to the house. Elvis didn't want the Colonel to know too much about what went on there. The house had a two-way mirror, and Elvis would use it to watch people. He was a voyeur. but it wasn't a big part of his life. In Hollywood, there were rumors that Elvis and his friends were gay because they didn't go to many parties. Elvis didn't like the people in Hollywood and thought they only wanted to be around him for his fame. He had an entourage of 7 to 13 guys, and they all lived together, which fueled the rumors, but the house was always full of women. Elvis was uncomfortable with physical contact from men. Even though they were close, he would flinch if someone put their arm around him. He was prejudiced against gay men and would get angry if he thought one of them had touched him. On movie sets, fans would come to the house all night long. The guys would have to answer the door and turn them away. On Friday and Saturday nights, Elvis would let the girls in, and the house would be packed. They'd watch TV, listen to music, and some of the guys would take the girls to their rooms. Elvis would usually take a few girls to his room when the night was over. Elvis's life was a mix of fame, money, and secrets. He trusted the wrong people and missed out on better deals. But he was still one of the most famous people in the world, and his house was always full of people who wanted to be with him. Marty Lacker and Billy Smith, two of Elvis Presley's closest friends, shared many stories about the king of rock and roll. These stories reveal a side of Elvis that few people ever saw. Marty remembered how some of the girls who came to see Elvis were hoping he could help advance their careers, but Elvis wasn't the type to make promises. He was a private person, and he didn't brag much about his sexual exploits, especially when he was younger. Sometimes he'd tell the guys about his encounters, but other times he'd keep it to himself. Marty said Elvis often made up stories just to get a reaction, and he loved manipulating people. If Elvis told them a secret and said, "Don't tell anyone or you're fired," they knew it wouldn't stay secret for long. Lamar Fike, another close friend, said Elvis had specific preferences when it came to women. He liked them to be dark-haired, petite, and about 5 feet 2 inches and 110 pounds. Elvis was particularly fond of women who would take care of him, almost like nurses. He wanted them to baby him, and he didn't like women who spoke their minds or were too smart. He preferred women who were subservient and wouldn't challenge him. This was partly because of how his mother raised him. Billy Smith had a slightly different take. He believed Elvis appreciated women with a good sense of humor and intelligence, but he agreed that Elvis didn't like women who were overly assertive. Elvis enjoyed being babied, but he could also be nurturing. However, he got tired of it quickly and wanted to move on. Elvis had some specific turn-offs too. Marty said dirty fingernails or toenails were a big no-go for him. He even refused to go to bed with a woman if her toes weren't clean and pretty. Lamar explained that Elvis was a complex person with many personalities. On stage, he was confident and charismatic, but offstage, he was more guarded. He didn't trust many people outside his close circle. The guys in his group were the only ones who really knew him. They acted as a shield, protecting him from the outside world. Elvis didn't want to be alone with strangers, and he always had at least one of the guys with him for company and protection. Elvis demanded special attention and didn't like it when things didn't revolve around him. Even at the group's birthday parties, he'd show up expecting everything to be about him. When they stopped inviting him, he got very upset. Marty recalled how Elvis always wanted to be in control, even in games. When they played cards, he insisted on being the banker, and would often rig the game in his favor. He'd make sure Sonny was on his right, so he could take the last card to improve his hand. Everyone owed Elvis money, but he never owed anyone anything. He justified it by saying, "The house always wins." Billy remembered an incident with Christina Crawford, the adopted daughter of Joan Crawford. She came to the house one night and started breaking Elvis's cigars. Elvis got angry, and after a heated exchange, he dragged her across a marble coffee table and kicked her out. She later apologized, saying she resented seeing her mother treat people the same way. Another time, Johnny Rivers, a singer, came to the house and heard Elvis's demo of the song Memphis. Johnny later released his own version, which made Elvis furious. When Johnny tried to come back to the house, Marty and Alan told him to leave or they'd throw him over the wall. Johnny never returned. Elvis had a few fights over the years, including one with a Marine. According to Elvis, the Marine and a friend cornered him in a park and started beating him up. Elvis pulled out a starter's pistol and threatened the Marine, leading to his arrest for assault and battery. He was eventually exonerated. Elvis also got into a fight with a service station attendant in 1956. The attendant got jealous when girls asked Elvis for autographs and demanded he move his car. When the attendant slapped Elvis, Elvis nearly beat him up. The attendant was fined and Elvis was cleared. Starting in 1956, Elvis began receiving death threats. One came on a postcard from Niagara Falls, and another was a handwritten letter from a woman in Canton, Ohio. She warned that a communist soldier from East Germany planned to kill Elvis. These threats made Elvis constantly watchful, and he started carrying a gun for protection. Elvis was a complex and often contradictory person. He demanded loyalty and attention, but could be cruel and manipulative. Despite his fame, he craved the comfort and protection of his close friends. They were the only ones who truly understood him and the challenges he faced. Elvis was always on edge, especially after that first death threat back in 1957. A woman was caught by the FBI, and she had threatened to bomb Elvis from an airplane. This made everyone in the group nervous. Every morning they had to start the cars, always expecting them to blow up. Even a plane flying overhead during a backyard game of badminton would send everyone running inside. This was when Elvis met Captain W. Woodward of the Memphis Police Department. Woodward was a big guy, about 6 feet 4 inches, and he became a constant presence in Elvis's life. He was assigned to Elvis's security detail, especially during shows in Memphis. Woodward helped manage a lot of tricky situations, and Elvis grew close to him, though no one ever really knew why. The fear of being shot only grew as the years went by. Elvis started carrying guns, and he even visited Care's sporting goods store in Beverly Hills to check out some firearms. While there, he ran into Paul Newman. Elvis, being his spontaneous self, showed Paul the guns he was carrying. Paul wasn't too impressed and quickly left. Elvis also started collecting real badges from law enforcement agencies, not just honorary ones. This only added to the nickname Crazy that Lamar and others started calling him. Elvis's movie, Wild in the Country, was a turning point. It was a dramatic role that Elvis really liked, but it didn't do well at the box office. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, used this as an excuse to push for more formulaic, money-making movies. The Colonel argued that serious roles like Wild in the Country and Flaming Star didn't make enough money. On the road, the group had their share of fun. They would stay in motels and play pranks, like moving all the furniture into another room and watching the room's service guy's reaction. When the manager came to investigate, they would have everything back in place, leaving the manager confused and red-faced. But despite the fun, there were always doubts. Elvis wondered if the people around him were really there for him, or just for what he could do for them. This made it hard to be around him, even though everyone really cared about him. Elvis had a way of being different personalities at different times. He would sometimes do the opposite of what you expected just to throw you off. It was a challenge to keep up with him, but it was also part of what made being around him so compelling. Elvis was also very loyal. If you got in a big argument with him, he would make sure to settle it that night. He wouldn't let it drag on. He showed his love through actions, like sticking up for you or buying you things. One time when Billy was at a car dealership, a salesman was rude to him. Elvis immediately stepped in, bought Billy a BMW, and had the salesman drive it to his house as a lesson in respect. Elvis's relationship with his stepbrothers, the Stanley boys, was complicated. They were brought into the group partly because Vernon, Elvis's father, asked him to. But Elvis always referred to them as D's boys or D's brats. Later, they were kept around mainly to help Elvis get drugs. Junior Smith, Elvis's first cousin, was a complex character. He had a sardonic wit and a dark past, including a traumatic experience in the Korean War. He was always sullen and struggled with alcohol and possibly drugs. Despite his issues, Elvis and Vernon were very fond of him. Junior could be fun to be around, but he also had a dangerous side, which made some of the group members wary. Red West, another member of the group, was always on guard around Junior. Junior had a tendency to wait outside doors, and could be violent when drunk. Despite his violent tendencies, Junior could also be soft-hearted. He was a complicated person, and his presence added to the unpredictable nature of life around Elvis. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. Something felt off, like a bad dream that I couldn't shake. I walked into Junior's room, and my heart almost stopped. He had thrown up, and there was blood mixed in it. It looked like it had come from his nose. He was lying there, not moving. I touched him, and he was stiff. Rigor mortis had set in, I thought. Oh no, he's dead. It was terrifying. I ran to where my parents were sleeping and woke my dad up. "Daddy, I think Junior's dead," I said. At first, he didn't believe me. But when he went to check, he saw it too. Junior had had a cerebral hemorrhage or maybe an alcoholic seizure. It was a shock. Elvis was really upset about Junior's death. He felt guilty, thinking he could have done more for the family. But the strangest thing was that Elvis became obsessed with death. He wanted to understand what it was like. Junior's body was at the Memphis funeral home, and Elvis insisted on going to see it. We went there around 3 or 4 in the morning. The place was locked, but a guy let us in through the back. We saw the body, and Elvis started talking about death. Then he said, "Let's go see how they do this." We walked through dark hallways, only a small green light guiding us. It was scary, and I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going, but Elvis was curious. We heard a noise, and it got louder as we moved. Finally, we saw a mortician. There were 2 of them on duty. One was working, and the other was sleeping in a casket. The noise was just the snoring. The other guy had rock and roll music playing. Elvis introduced himself, and the mortician was excited to meet a famous person. They talked for a while, and Elvis asked all sorts of questions. I saw a couple of bodies covered with sheets, and almost jumped out of my skin when I backed into a cart with a body on it. It was too much for me, but Elvis was fascinated. He did this a few times over the years, always when someone he knew had passed away. He wanted to understand death and face his fears. Bobby, my brother, was a lot like Junior. They were both troubled. When we moved to Graceland, Bobby and I were just teenagers. Suddenly, we were living in this big house, and everyone was making a fuss over Elvis. It was exciting, but it also changed Bobby. He started getting into trouble. He had a heart murmur, but I don't think that's what caused the problems. I think it was the mix of pride and envy in our family that made him act out. Elvis tried to help Bobby, but he was too busy with his career. Bobby started writing bad checks using Elvis's name. He'd buy things and then get caught. He even conned a cab driver into bringing him home from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, promising that Elvis would pay the fare. But of course, Elvis didn't know about it, and the cab driver ended up at Graceland, where my dad was the gate guard. It was a mess. Bobby also started taking cars from dealerships, saying he was picking them out for Elvis. He'd drive them for a while, and then tell the dealers to come pick them up. It was a pattern that repeated over and over. Elvis had many talks with Bobby, trying to help him, but it didn't seem to work. Bobby's life kept getting worse. He got into fights, had trouble with women, and couldn't hold a job. One night in 1961, Bobby was hit by a car in front of Graceland. He was badly injured, and it was a tough time for our family. After that, Bobby started suing people whenever he got hurt. He had a bitter attitude, thinking the world owed him something. His life became a series of disappointments and setbacks. In 1968, Bobby took rat poison. I found him and tried to help, but it was too late. He was only 27. It was a tragedy, and it made me think about what life could have been like if we had both grown up together. Elvis was making a movie at the time and couldn't come home for Bobby's funeral. He felt guilty about not being there more for Bobby and other family members who had passed away. A lot of our relatives died young, and it sometimes felt like a curse on our family. In 1961, Elvis signed a new movie contract. He went to Hawaii to film Blue Hawaii, which became his biggest hit. The movie made a lot of money, but it also meant Elvis was stuck making similar films for years. Before filming, he did a benefit concert in Honolulu to raise money for a memorial to the USS Arizona. It was a big deal, and Elvis was nervous. He hadn't performed live in years, and it turned out to be his last concert for 7 years. Colonel was excited about Blue Hawaii and had Elvis do a lot of promotions for a local radio station. It was a special time, but it also marked the beginning of a long period where Elvis was trapped in a cycle of making movies that didn't challenge him as an actor. The year 1961 was a roller coaster for Elvis and his friends. The movies were still rolling, but things were changing. Elvis was no longer the fresh-faced kid from Memphis. He was a star, but the pressure was mounting. His manager, Colonel Parker, was always looking for ways to keep Elvis in the spotlight, even if it meant making everyone around him look a bit silly. Lamar Fike remembered how Colonel would play mind games with the guys, making them quack like ducks or bark like dogs just for a laugh. But Elvis wouldn't let anyone yell at his friends. When Lamar got stuck in the sand with the limo during the filming of Follow That Dream, Elvis stood up to the director, Gordon Douglas, and threatened to walk off the set if anyone disrespected his crew. Elvis's energy was still there, but the quality of the songs in his movies was starting to slip. Billy Smith recalled how Elvis could spot a hit instantly, like Can't Help Falling in Love from Blue Hawaii. But by the time of Follow That Dream, the songs weren't as strong. Elvis still tried his best, even with the bad ones, but the magic wasn't the same. In the studio, Elvis was a perfectionist. He'd do take after take until he got it right, sometimes going through 80 takes just to get one song right. But as the years went on, the movies and their songs took a toll. Elvis's sessions in Nashville with the Jordanaires and his trusted band were still special, but the energy from the early days was fading. The pills were starting to take a bigger role in their lives. Marty Lacker, who joined Elvis's team in 1961, remembered the first time Elvis introduced him to uppers like Dexedrine and downers like Tuinals. Elvis kept huge jars of pills in a safe at Graceland, and another safe for travel. They got the pills from everywhere, even from a dentist in California named Max Shapiro, who was known as Dr. Feelgood. Elvis's personal life was also evolving. He started renting the Memphian Theater in Memphis for midnight movie screenings, where he could invite his inner circle. He had his own rituals, like sitting in the same spot every time and having a drink table with water, Pepsi, and cigars. But these private screenings were more than just movies. They were a way for Elvis to escape the pressures of being a star. Marty Lacker, who had a family by then, took a job with Elvis, even though the pay was barely enough to support his wife and daughter. But Elvis's generosity was undeniable. He understood the desire for nice things, like the cars he promised to buy for his friends. For Elvis, it was about more than just money. It was about fulfilling dreams. By the end of 1961, Elvis was still at the top of his game, but the signs of change were there. The pills, the pressure, and the changing music scene were all taking their toll. Yet in the midst of it all, Elvis's commitment to his friends and his craft remained unshaken. As the decade progressed, the world would continue to watch, wondering what the future held for the king of rock and roll.